There is a reason humanity has always been terrified of the dark spaces beneath the earth. It is perhaps our oldest, most primal fear, the dread of what waits in the lightless depths, thousands of years ago. Our ancestors huddled in the mouths of caves to survive the freezing rain and the claws of apex predators. Yet, even they understood an unspoken rule. There are certain caverns you simply do not enter. There are depths from which you do not return. Across almost every ancient culture, the underground is not just rock and dirt. It is the domain of the dead, a territory of monsters and forces best left undisturbed. The Greeks were certain that Hades ruled a shadow kingdom just below their feet. The Norse spoke in hushed tones of the great serpent Nidhogg in the crushing dark. Deep in South America, tribes whispered of secret tunnels leading to a hidden world where time itself moves at a distorted pace. We often dismiss these stories as beautiful myths, tales invented by minds trying to make sense of the dark. But as someone investigating the forgotten, I have to ask, what if real anomalies inspired those legends? Mainstream science views caves with cold logic. Geologists see mere cavities carved by water. Biologists see isolated ecosystems of blind fish. Tourists just see illuminated stalactites. But professional speleologists, the explorers who actually push into the crushing, lightless deep, know the truth. They have seen things hiding in the dark that completely shatter the neat, rational explanations found in our modern scientific textbooks. We are talking about discoveries that defy all logic. Artifacts buried in solid stone that have no right being there. Footprints of creatures that biology refuses to acknowledge. And encounters that leave seasoned veterans waking up in cold sweats. Today, you and I are going to unpack this together. We will examine 5 of the most chilling, unexplained discoveries ever made beneath the earth. Our investigation begins in Romania with the infamous Movile Cave. The year was 1986. A construction crew was conducting a routine geological survey near the Black Sea, preparing the ground for a massive power plant. They were simply drilling through the bedrock when the earth gave way, accidentally tearing open a portal to an underground world that was never meant to be found. When the first researchers lowered themselves into the oppressive darkness of that shaft, they realized they had breached something extraordinary. The cavern was hermetically sealed in solid rock. There was not a single microfracture that could have let in a breath of surface air. Geologists calculated that this vault had been completely cut off from the outside world for 5.5 million years. Think about that, 5.5 million. When this cave closed shut, modern humans did not even exist. Our distant ancestors in Africa were just beginning to stand upright. Furthermore, the air inside was thick and lethal. It held 5 times less oxygen than the world above, choking the lungs with massive, deadly concentrations of hydrogen sulfide and carbon dioxide. A truly toxic environment. Step into that cavern without heavy breathing gear, and the fumes will strip you of consciousness in minutes. Naturally, science expected to find a barren, lifeless tomb. The logic seemed bulletproof, with absolute darkness, almost zero oxygen and choking poison gas. Survival is impossible. But what researchers pulled out of the dark shattered our rigid definitions of biology. The cavern was crawling with life. They uncovered strange species existing nowhere else on the planet. They found pale spiders without eyes, vicious leeches that hunt prey instead of drinking blood, aquatic scorpions and worms thriving in pure liquid sulfur. In total, they cataloged over 50 distinct species in that toxic darkness, 35 of which were entirely new to modern science. These pale anomalies never felt a single ray of sunlight. They never took a breath of normal air. They were thriving in a brutal environment that would instantly execute any surface-dwelling animal. Yet, The truly unsettling part was not just their bizarre biology. It was the fact that this underground ecosystem operated under completely alien rules. On the surface, every living thing bows to the sun. Plants harvest the light, animals consume the plants, and predators hunt those animals. Without the sun, the cycle dies. But in Movile, the sun had been dead to them for 5 million years. Instead, the foundation of their twisted food chain relied on strange bacteria that feasted directly on the deadly hydrogen sulfide and toxic chemicals seeping through the jagged rocks. These organisms literally ate solid stone and poison vapors, while the rest of the cave's monsters fed on them. This process is known as chemosynthesis. Before this discovery, experts smugly declared that this phenomenon only existed at the bottom of the ocean, near boiling volcanic vents. No one believed a complex web of predators and prey could flourish inside a sealed vault for ages. Even today, the brightest scientific minds cannot fully explain it. They cannot agree on how this dark environment generates enough raw energy to fuel such biological diversity. More hauntingly, they cannot explain why several blind predators perfectly match species that went globally extinct millions of years ago. It is as if this toxic cave was a living vault, perfectly locked in ancient time. I recall the notes of one of the lead biologists who first breached the Movile depths. He confessed that when his flashlight beam landed on those bizarre spiders, ghost white, entirely devoid of eyes, moving on grotesque, disproportionately long legs, his blood ran cold. He felt an overwhelming certainty that he was staring at biological life from another planet. He did not mean it as a poetic metaphor. He meant it quite literally. These twitching anomalies were so violently different from any natural species he had ever studied that, for a fleeting moment, his rational mind refused to accept that he was still standing on planet Earth. And that raw, visceral shock leads directly into the deeply uncomfortable question that elite biologists now only dare to whisper behind closed doors. If a thriving ecosystem can aggressively multiply in a lightless prison of poison, gas and bare stone, why are we so arrogant about dead planets? We know Mars is riddled with deep underground tunnels. We know the moons of Jupiter hide massive oceans beneath frozen crusts. After the Movile anomaly, no serious scientist can confidently declare that biology demands sunlight and oxygen. Movile proved that life is far more vicious, resilient, and inventive than our textbooks claim, a truth that is both deeply awe-inspiring and profoundly terrifying. This brings us to our second mystery, the Movile Cave system, hidden high in the freezing Austrian Alps. In 2014, a small, ambitious team of cave explorers descended into its long-forgotten, rocky depths. Locals in the surrounding alpine villages had known about the Movile cavern for generations, yet no one ever dared to push deep inside. The entrance was a suffocating narrow crack in the rock. Village elders warned of low, rhythmic groans and strange humming noises bleeding from the dark. Science naturally brushed this off as simple physics, cold mountain air squeezing through limestone vents, mimicking voices. Stick with me, because this is where the rational explanations fall apart. When the expedition finally forced their way through that claustrophobic tunnel, they dropped into a massive cavern 100 meters below the surface. Sweeping their heavy flashlights across the rough stone walls, they uncovered a sprawling, intricate sight that absolutely defied all modern historical explanation. We are not talking about random scratches or primitive gouges. The cavern was dominated by deliberate, detailed murals executed in thick red and black pigments. They found sprawling depictions of beasts, sharp geometric shapes, and deeply unsettling symbols. Now, ancient cave art in Europe is well documented. That alone does not rewrite history. But the Movile murals operated on a completely different, terrifying level. The stone canvas showed precise illustrations of creatures that never existed in the European fossil record. The artists drew massive feline predators armed with impossibly long fangs and towering beasts resembling short-necked giraffes. Yet, the most chilling discovery of all was a towering, dominant central figure the stunned research team quietly dubbed the Horned Man. The mural showed a muscular humanoid torso, but the head was entirely obscured by a massive crown of branching horns. This was no ordinary hunter wearing a deer's skull. The anatomical proportions were entirely wrong. The heavy antlers flared outward before curving violently forward, forming a sinister, cage-like helmet. When scientists sent paint samples for laboratory analysis, the data shattered accepted timelines. The pigments were shockingly ancient, predating the famous prehistoric art of the Lascaux caves in France. But the sheer age was not the true anomaly. The chemical breakdown revealed a rare mineral binder completely absent from the local alpine geology. The closest known natural deposit of this specific raw material was buried in the earth several hundred kilometers away. This forces us to confront two impossible scenarios. Either the artist survived a brutal migration to harvest this specific pigment, or they acquired it through a sophisticated trade network, a network mainstream historians insist did not exist in that primitive era. But the paint was not what kept researchers awake at night. It was the cryptic symbols. Painted beside the beasts were deliberate sequences of dots and sharp slashes. This was no random scratching in the dark. The dots marched in rigid, intentional rows. Thick lines deliberately connected specific clusters, and identical geometric combinations repeated flawlessly across the cavern walls. We are not looking at primitive, meaningless cave decoration. We are staring directly at a rigid, highly calculated system. Archaeologists stared at these sequences and saw a methodical counting system. Perhaps this mind was tracking the days, tallying slaughtered prey, or measuring something darker we can only guess at. Others argued it was an advanced astronomical calendar, noting the clusters aligned perfectly with lunar cycles. But the real shock came when a paleolinguist examined the evidence. They stated the syntax mirrored actual proto-writing. If true, it means early humans were systematically recording complex thoughts on stone thousands of years before textbooks claim it was possible. It violently shatters our entire accepted chronology of cognitive evolution. The response from the authorities was immediate and incredibly telling. The cavern was quietly classified, and all civilian access was strictly barred. Official research continues behind locked gates, but data is suspiciously drip-fed to the public. It feels like a deliberate cover-up, as if someone is terrified of exposing the truth about the Horned Man. But let us move on. You have to picture the scale of our third anomaly, the staggering Son Doong cave system in Vietnam. It is the largest subterranean void on the planet. It is so impossibly massive that it generates its own weather system, complete with heavy clouds, rivers, and a dense underground jungle. The rocky ceiling soars 200 meters high. You could drop a 40-story skyscraper inside, and it would not even graze the stone canopy. A local farmer stumbled upon the howling entrance in 1991. But its terrifying depth kept professional explorers completely away until 2009. Since then, every expedition into Son Doong finds anomalies that entirely defy logic. The most unnerving incident occurred in 2019. A survey crew pushed into a side fracture previously mapped as a dead end, behind a heavy rockfall. They breached a hidden corridor stretching deeply into the dark. The atmosphere instantly shifted. The air grew warm and humid, carrying a faint, sickly sweet odor that no one could identify. At the bottom, Their flashlights swept over a vast, silent chamber. The floor was completely buried beneath a thick layer of a pale, powdery substance, resembling fine flour. The team assumed it was just degraded limestone or a strange mineral deposit, but the exact moment the lead explorer planted his heavy boot onto the pale powder, the seemingly lifeless floor violently reacted to his weight. Let me take you down into the dark. We are going to look at something that science is still trying to understand. Picture stepping onto the cave floor. It squished slightly under the boot, then slowly regained its shape. Exactly like memory foam, but this was not foam. Lab tests revealed it was a massive colony of microorganisms, fungi, or something similar, forming a solid, living carpet nearly 2 feet thick. The biologists who put these samples under a microscope hit a brick wall. It did not match a single known species on Earth. The cellular structure completely broke standard classification rules. It was not a fungus, not a bacteria, not an algae, it was something caught in the middle. One microbiologist noted it looked like evolution, simply took an entirely different road. But the real shock came when the lights went out. This strange carpet was actually reacting to human presence. The moment researchers walked into the cavern, the ground around their boots began to emit a very faint, pale blue glow. It was barely visible in the absolute blackness of the cave. If they stood perfectly still, the pale light faded away into nothing. But the second they moved, the glow flared up again. It was as if the organism could feel the vibration of their heavy footsteps or the sudden shift in air pressure. Now mainstream biology knows all about bioluminescence, fireflies, deep-sea anglerfish, certain types of mushrooms, but a massive underground organism reacting to movement with targeted, localized light. Nothing like that exists in any textbook. Naturally, the science team tried to break the illusion. They ran test after test. They tossed heavy rocks onto the living floor. The carpet stayed completely dark. They poured cold water over the surface. Absolutely zero reaction. Yet the second a human took a single step, a ring of soft blue light bloomed around. Their foot, slowly fading out over several long seconds. One researcher cautiously suggested we might be looking at a primitive form of communication, or perhaps a blind defense mechanism. Another argued the creature was not feeling vibrations at all, but rather sensing the radiant heat of a human body, or maybe the carbon dioxide in our breath. Both were reasonable guesses, but neither hypothesis could fully explain the exact mechanics of what they were seeing. Think about it logically for a moment. Who exactly is an organism living in pitch-black darkness trying to talk to? What is it trying to scare away? Down at that extreme depth, it has no natural predators. It has no real competition. There is nothing down there but tiny insects and microscopic bacteria. Why would a blind entity, isolated in the dark for millions of years, suddenly need to glow? And why does it only react to something the exact size and temperature of a human being? We still do not have those answers. Samples were shipped to top labs around the world. But a complete biological profile remains out of reach. The creature simply dies outside its cave. The chamber has now been sealed off entirely, out of fear that human breath might destroy the anomaly forever. That brings us to our next bizarre discovery: the Krubera Cave in Abkhazia. Until very recently, this was considered the deepest known cave system on the entire planet. It plunges more than 2 kilometers straight down into the crust of the Earth. Reaching the bottom is a brutal, exhausting descent that takes several days. You have to squeeze through claustrophobic tunnels, swim freezing underground rivers, and rappel down sheer vertical drops, even for the most elite cavers in the world. Surviving this drop is an extreme test of endurance. Scientists have been trying to map this black abyss since the 1960s. with every new expedition pushing just a few meters deeper into the dark, setting new records and bringing back new questions. But one specific team brought back something far stranger than a depth record. They brought back a mystery that still keeps geologists awake at night. At a depth of roughly 1.5 kilometers, the team squeezed into a side tunnel no one had ever mapped before. They stepped into a chamber with an impossible floor. It was perfectly smooth. Now, water can polish stone over thousands of years, making it slick. But this was different. This was a flawless, uniform smoothness, completely missing the wavy lines of water erosion. No cracks, no natural dips. It looked exactly as if someone had poured a thin layer of dark resin over the rock and let it harden. Lab analysis later confirmed the floor was coated in a substance chemically identical to obsidian, a volcanic glass. Here is the problem with that finding. There is absolutely zero volcanic activity anywhere near this region. The closest dormant volcano is hundreds of kilometers away. How volcanic glass managed to coat the floor of an isolated cavern 1.5 kilometers underground defies all geological logic, but the glass floor was only the beginning. The explorers shined their lights on the walls and found deep, parallel grooves carved into the stone. They were roughly a centimeter deep, running horizontally along the entire perimeter of the room, about 1.5 meters above the floor. It looked exactly like something had dragged giant claws across the rock. The spacing between each groove was a perfect 4 centimeters. Geologists immediately ruled out natural erosion. Running water simply does not leave perfectly spaced parallel scratches. Wind does not exist at that depth. Tectonic shifts shatter rocks. They do not carve neat, horizontal lines. One of the explorers, a man with a background in biology, pointed out an unsettling detail. The 4-centimeter gap between the grooves perfectly matched the claw spacing of a massive predatory animal. But what kind of beast could possibly survive a mile underground, living in eternal darkness, without a single visible food source? To find out, the team rigged the chamber with infrared motion tracking cameras. They left the equipment down there in the freezing blackness for 3 full months. When they finally retrieved the memory cards, almost all the footage was dead space. Empty silence, but hidden deep in the files, recorded right around the 6-week mark, the motion sensor had triggered. The camera woke up and captured exactly 4 seconds of footage. On the grainy infrared video, you can clearly see something massive flash across the frame. A large, pale shape, moving incredibly fast, staying very low to the obsidian floor. The image is terribly blurred. The object was simply moving way too fast for the low frame rate of the remote camera to catch a clean still. You cannot make out any facial features or limbs, but one thing is absolutely certain. It was not falling rocks, it was not a sudden burst of water, and it was not a trick of the shadows. It was a living, breathing entity moving with sudden purpose, a mile below the surface of the earth. When they finally showed this strange footage to top zoologists, the room split into factions. A few experts argued it must have been an abnormally large bat, even though bats are never found at that extreme depth. Others desperately suggested a wild badger had somehow wandered down from the surface. But the cavers who had actually bled to reach that room shut those theories down fast. No surface animal could ever survive the drop. The tunnels are brutally tight, blocked by underwater sumps and massive vertical shafts that require ropes and specialized climbing gear. There are stretches where a grown man must crawl flat on his stomach for an hour. No mammal the size of a dog could accidentally stumble its way down that labyrinth, which leads us to a much darker thought. What if this massive creature did not wander down from the surface at all? What if it was born down there, hunting in absolute darkness, surviving at a constant 5 degrees Celsius? What could it possibly be eating to sustain that kind of speed and muscle mass? The original 4-second video is still being picked apart by image analysts. But the scientific community remains totally silent on a final verdict. The team actually went back down and set up the cameras a second time. The sensors never triggered again, but every single caver who spent time mapping that specific obsidian chamber reported the exact same chilling detail. Whenever they stopped moving, hovering right on the edge of hearing, there was a sound. Not water, not settling rock. It sounded like a very slow, heavy exhale. You and I are going to look at this next piece of the puzzle together, because this is where the accepted timeline of history completely shatters. Let us move to our fifth case, Taylor Cave, hidden away in a very remote, unforgiving stretch of southeastern Alaska. This entire isolated zone is permanently locked in brutal permafrost. The entrance was only discovered by pure luck back in 2007, when a rapidly melting glacier finally exposed a jagged hole in the rock that had been buried for millennia. The first official scientific expedition climbed inside a year later. It was not a massive cave system by any standard, stretching barely 300 meters deep. But what was waiting in the freezing dark sent shockwaves straight through the paleontological world. Deep in the back of the cavern, trapped in a chamber where the temperature never rises above freezing, explorers found animal remains entombed in the solid ice wall. Now, finding frozen bones in the Arctic is not exactly breaking news. We pull woolly rhinos, ancient wild horses, and massive mammoths out of the permafrost all the time. But this was entirely different. The frozen ice held 3 nearly perfect, fully intact skeletons. They were curled up right next to each other, looking as if they had simply laid down together to sleep. In terms of size, they sat somewhere between a large gray wolf and a juvenile black bear, but the bone structure made absolutely no sense. The front limbs were significantly longer than the back legs, much closer to the anatomy of a silverback gorilla. The skulls were heavily elongated, featuring brutal, thick jawbones and massive eye sockets built for low light. The teeth did not match a pure apex predator, nor did they belong to a grazing herbivore. They were a bizarre hybrid, clearly designed for an omnivorous diet, but armed with unnaturally long, wicked canines. The paleontologists who studied the high-resolution scans hit a wall. These remains could not be assigned to any known animal family tree. It was not a mutated bear, not an ancient wolf, not a giant wolverine. The bone ratios did not match any creature ever logged by human science, living or extinct. One senior fossil expert quietly admitted that if he had not physically held the freezing bones in his own hands, he would have sworn the entire thing was a clever hoax. Stick with me for a moment, because the biological anomaly is only half the mystery. Carbon dating placed the bones at exactly 40,000 years old. This was the raw, violent era when massive saber-toothed cats and giant ground sloths dominated the Alaskan tundra. Yet, these strange gorilla BRS do not exist in the fossil record. But the truly chilling part was how they were found. The 3 skeletons were arranged in a deliberate semicircle, skulls facing inward. Right in the middle of them sat a flat stone slab, way too perfectly leveled to be a natural rock fall. The surface was stained black. Chemical tests proved it was a mix of ancient animal fat and wood soot. Something had burned there. Scattered around the slab were tiny, sharp bone needles, carved with absolute precision. There is no debating what those carved shards were. They were primitive tools, but orthodox science draws a very hard line here. Complex tool-making is restricted exclusively to early humans and a handful of higher primate species. But these ice cave skeletons were absolutely not primates. Their heavy bone structure shared 0 DNA traits with any known monkey or human ancestor. It was an entirely alien anatomy, driven by completely different biomechanics and muscle attachments. It was a phantom species missing from every biology textbook on the planet. Theories started flying wild. Cautious academics claimed it was just a terribly deformed local bear population. Braver voices suggested we were looking at a forgotten branch of apex predators that independently evolved the intelligence to use fire. Let us piece this together, shall we? One bold zoologist stepped forward with a theory that sent shockwaves through the academic world. He suggested we were looking at a creature that had just begun to walk the path of intelligence. A shadow branch of evolution, a failed competitor to early humans that vanished before it could truly thrive. Official science, naturally, refused to support this wild claim, yet they failed to offer any convincing alternative. When whispers leaked to the press, thrill seekers swarmed the Alaskan ice. The authorities moved fast. They sealed the cave, claiming they needed to preserve the site. The bones were packed into crates and locked away in a government laboratory where they remain to this day. A complete scientific analysis. It has never seen the light of day. 15 years have slipped by, and those 3 skeletons from the frozen Alaskan cave remain one of the most unsettling puzzles in paleontology. We are looking at 5 distinct stories from 5 separate caves scattered across the globe. Romania, Austria, Vietnam, Abkhazia, Alaska, they share absolutely no common ground in their geology, their climate, or their history. Yet every single one of them harbored something that mainstream science simply cannot explain away. An entire biological ecosystem, surviving in total darkness for 5 million years. Ancient rock drawings that predate all known human art, featuring strange geometric symbols that look exactly like an early form of written language. A mysterious biological organism that literally glows in direct response to human presence. Add to this list something massive and terrifyingly fast, caught on camera in the pitch blackness 1.5 kilometers down. Add those skeletons of unidentified beasts that somehow knew how to wield tools and control fire. Each isolated discovery raises uncomfortable questions, but together they form a staggering picture. We have grown far too comfortable believing we understand our own planet. We drew maps, measured the highest mountains, scanned the ocean floors, and even sent rovers to Mars. Yet, right under the soles of our shoes, sometimes just a few dozen feet beneath the concrete we walk on every day, an entirely different reality thrives. A vast, silent world that we know absolutely nothing about. The subterranean network makes up a staggering portion of the Earth's crust. Hundreds of thousands of kilometers of winding, silent tunnels. The vast majority of these passages have never felt a human footprint. We do not even know where most of their entrances are hidden. What else is waiting down there in the dark? What strange entities prowl through corridors untouched by sunlight? What life has been quietly evolving for millions of years in total isolation? Entirely unaware that humanity exists, what fragments of forgotten history sit undisturbed in sealed chambers? We simply do not know, and perhaps deep down we prefer to look the other way. Because these caves are not just empty holes in the bedrock. They are the physical, enduring memory of our world. And the Earth, it seems, holds secrets we are not ready to face. You and I have spent our lives walking the surface, looking at the stars, assuming we understand our reality. But the deeper we investigate, the more we realize how fragile that understanding truly is. The ice, the stone, and the endless dark tunnels beneath our cities do not care about official scientific narratives. They keep their own records and guard their own mysteries. We might keep pushing, shining our lights into the abyss, hoping to drag ancient truths into the open. But some doors remain sealed for a reason. The evidence is still down there, waiting in the shadows. indifferent to whether we believe in it or not. We just have to decide if we are truly prepared for what happens when the dark finally pushes back.